You've been showing up the same way over and over again, and you're wondering why the relationship feels stuck, why things aren't progressing, why he's distant, non-committal, or even indifferent. But here's the truth. What we tolerate, we teach, and what we repeat becomes the rhythm the other person dances to. If you've been giving too much, over-explaining, chasing clarity, or constantly being the one to fix the distance, you've essentially cast yourself in a role. And the problem isn't just that you're playing that role, it's that he's come to expect it. Now imagine this. You're in a movie that keeps playing the same scene. He pulls away and you reach out. He gets quiet and you fill the silence. He forgets to text and you forgive before he even explains. And slowly but surely, this becomes the pattern. Not because you're not valuable, but because the role you've taken is rooted in fear. Fear of losing him, fear of not being enough, fear of creating conflict. But if you're always the one doing the emotional labor, you've made yourself predictable. And predictability in that kind of imbalance isn't comforting. It's enabling. The move he won't see coming is when you decide you're done playing that role. Not out of spite, not to manipulate, not to get a reaction, but because you finally understand that your value doesn't rise or fall based on how much you give, fix, or chase. When you stop showing up in the way you always have, something powerful happens. The script changes. The entire dynamic shifts. Suddenly, the part of you that used to say, maybe if I try harder, he'll appreciate me, gets replaced with a new voice, one that says, I don't need to be in this loop to prove my worth. And here's where it gets real. You don't even need to make a speech about it. You don't need to sit him down and say, I'm changing the way I show up, because change doesn't have to be announced. It's felt. It's noticed in your pauses, your boundaries, the way you no longer chase validation. It's in the moment he sends a dry, half-hearted text and you don't respond with a paragraph trying to reignite the spark. It's when he takes 2 days to check in and you don't rush to reward the bare minimum. It's when you stop trying to decode mixed signals because suddenly you're not trying to convince him anymore. You're observing instead. And when you do that, when you interrupt the pattern you've been part of, you give him 2 choices: evolve or fall behind, because you're no longer feeding the same cycle. You're no longer reacting on cue. You've created space, and space is where realization lives. It's in that space that he'll start to notice your absence in a way he never noticed your presence, because before, your presence was a given. Now it's a decision you get to make from a place of clarity and confidence, not attachment and fear. But this isn't about pretending to be distant or faking detachment. It's about actually stepping into a new energy, one where you are not driven by the fear of losing someone, but by the desire to find alignment. One where you're not shrinking yourself to keep the peace, but expanding yourself to find your power. Because when you stop playing the old role, you start reclaiming your sense of self. The you that existed before you bent your boundaries for connection. The you that remembered what she deserved before she settled for comfort, dressed as consistency. And when you bring that version of yourself forward, everything begins to look different. Conversations sound different. Your responses have more weight. You're not available in the same way. And not because you're trying to punish him, but because you've started prioritizing yourself. You've finally realized that love doesn't have to look like sacrifice. It can look like wholeness, strength, and calm certainty. And the most magnetic thing you can ever do is stop being predictable in a dynamic that has been relying on your predictability. When you stop playing the old role, you don't just change the story, you change how the story ends. There comes a moment when the constant giving, chasing, and analyzing becomes exhausting. Not because you're weak, but because you're finally seeing how much of yourself you've been pouring into something that isn't pouring back. You start noticing how many times you've tried to re-spark the conversation, smooth over the awkward silences, or initiate connection just to feel like you're not being forgotten. That kind of effort doesn't go unnoticed by the heart. It accumulates. And when the emotional weight becomes too heavy, that's when something inside you starts whispering a different message. Not try harder, but pull back. Now, this isn't about games. It's not about silence to manipulate or absence to punish. It's about shifting your energy from a place of neediness to one of self-respect. When you pull back your energy, you're not disappearing. you're redirecting. You're taking all the energy you use to give away so freely and placing it where it actually builds you instead of depleting you. That means you stop overextending yourself for someone who doesn't show up with the same level of intention. You stop crafting texts that you hope will reignite something in him. You stop scanning every interaction for hidden meaning. You start reclaiming your peace. When a person gets used to your energy being readily available, it becomes background noise. Not because you're not valuable, but because consistency without boundaries can breed complacency. And when someone knows you'll always be there no matter how they show up, they stop showing up fully. So the moment you stop over-delivering, when you pull back and no longer offer constant validation, attention, or emotional caretaking, that's when the silence becomes loud. That's when your absence has impact, because now it's not about what you're giving, it's about what's missing when you stop giving. It's in those quiet moments that realization starts to surface. When he checks his phone and there's no message from you. When he posts a story and doesn't get your usual response. When a day passes and you're not the one making things easy. That space creates contrast. And contrast is what makes people reflect. But again, it's not a tactic, it's a byproduct of you finally putting your energy where it belongs. Because the truth is, if you have to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship, it's not a relationship, it's a performance. There's power in restraint. Not the kind that's fueled by ego, but the kind that comes from inner peace. It's when you can sit with your own discomfort instead of running to fill the void. It's when you can resist the urge to reach out, not because you're trying to seem strong, but because you realize that connection should be mutual. That communication should be a two-way street, not a one-sided effort to keep something alive that may not be breathing on its own anymore. Pulling back your energy is not about playing hard to get, it's about honoring your capacity. You start to see things for what they are, not for what you hope they could be. You stop needing his responses to feel whole. You stop needing his attention to feel attractive. And slowly, your peace returns. Your thoughts become quieter. You start noticing where you've been giving too much of yourself. Maybe it's the way you always made excuses for his lack of effort. Maybe it's the way you lowered your expectations just to keep the connection going. Maybe it's the way you ignored your own needs because you didn't want to seem too much. All of that starts to shift when you step back and look at the dynamic through clear eyes. Because when you're no longer hyper-focused on how to get his attention or fix the emotional imbalance, you start paying attention to your own needs. You begin to nourish the parts of you that have been neglected, your friendships, your passions, your sense of joy. You fill your life with things that energize you instead of drain you. And without even realizing it, you start becoming the version of yourself that doesn't just attract someone's interest. You command their respect. Because you've shown not just him, but yourself, that your energy is precious, that it's not something you'll keep offering to someone who doesn't know how to receive it with the same care. You've moved from convincing to choosing, and in that space, everything starts to shift. There's something quietly powerful about transformation that doesn't need to be announced. Most people, when they start to change, feel the urge to tell the world, to explain, to post, to prove. But when you're truly evolving, when something inside you has shifted for real, you don't need to say much. Because the energy around you changes. The way you walk into a room changes. The way people feel around you changes. And the people who once overlooked your presence start noticing something different, not because you told them to, but because it's undeniable. After a relationship, or even during one that's become stagnant or confusing, there's a temptation to make growth a performance, to broadcast your progress, to post pictures, quotes, life updates, just to show him what he's missing. But that kind of growth still has strings attached. It's still tied to his reaction. It's still rooted in seeking validation. The breakthrough comes when you grow for you, when your progress isn't for show, but for alignment, when your life starts reflecting the person you're becoming, not the one who was stuck waiting for someone else to catch up. And that growth, it shows up in ways that are subtle but striking. Maybe you start taking care of yourself differently, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. You start prioritizing your time, your boundaries, your peace. You become more intentional about where you place your energy. You stop engaging in the same cycles, responding to late-night texts, over-explaining your worth, giving access to someone who doesn't know how to value it. You stop needing closure from someone who couldn't offer clarity when it mattered. You begin to understand that the closure you needed was in how you decided to move forward, not in what he had to say. When he does reach out, maybe you don't reply right away. Not out of spite, but because you're genuinely busy living your life. And that's the shift. Before, you were waiting for his energy to dictate yours. Now, your life moves whether he shows up or not. That kind of shift is magnetic. Not because you're trying to be, but because wholeness always is. People can feel when you've stopped orbiting around them. They feel the difference between someone trying to get attention and someone who doesn't need it. You might find that your conversations change. The things you used to tolerate, you no longer entertain. The way you communicate is clearer, more grounded, less emotional. You speak from a place of calm rather than reaction. You're not baited by inconsistency anymore. You've lost interest in proving yourself to someone who didn't see you clearly the first time. And when he notices, he might try to re-enter the story the same way he always has, testing to see if the old version of you is still available. But she's not. She's been replaced by someone who no longer trades peace for potential, someone who's no longer hoping he'll be different, but instead focused on being different herself. The irony is, when you make this internal shift, the version of you he once took for granted is no longer accessible. And not because you're trying to teach him a lesson, but because you've genuinely outgrown that dynamic. You've outgrown the version of yourself who was waiting, hoping, adjusting. You don't need him to realize your value. You've realized it for yourself. And that's what makes this move so unexpected. He was used to a version of you that needed reassurance, attention, maybe even rescue. But now you're standing on your own, quietly, unapologetically. No posts, no cryptic quotes, just a steady life that no longer makes space for inconsistency. This is the kind of growth that makes people pause. It's not loud, but it lingers. It raises questions. It creates curiosity. Because while others are trying to make a point, you're making progress. You've stopped explaining yourself. You've stopped performing. You've started simply being. And that shift in your energy, that quiet confidence is the move he never expected, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was calm. It was rooted. It was clear. And clarity is something most people aren't ready for, especially when they're still used to the version of you who wasn't sure, but you're not in that place anymore. You're living in your own momentum, and the power of that doesn't need to be posted, spoken, or proven. It speaks for itself. There comes a time when you stop trying to fit into someone else's rhythm and you start creating your own. Not in rebellion, not in anger, but in clarity. You've spent enough time trying to be easygoing, trying to not ask for too much, trying to be the one who makes everything work. You've downplayed your needs, you've softened your voice, and you've become incredibly good at adapting. But in the process, you've forgotten that you were never meant to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's world. You were meant to build your own and invite someone in who actually wants to stay. When you redefine the standard, everything shifts. It's not about asking for more in a loud or demanding way. It's about embodying more. You move from trying to be accepted to choosing what belongs in your life. You stop explaining your boundaries and start living them. The things that once pulled you into emotional confusion, mixed signals, inconsistent effort, breadcrumbs of affection, no longer pull you in because they no longer match the life you're building. You're not looking for drama masked as passion. You're not looking to decode every text like it's a puzzle. You're looking for alignment, consistency, depth, and anything less than that just starts to feel like noise. What used to excite you? Him finally texting back, him calling you beautiful after 3 days of silence, him giving just enough to keep you there, now just feels like a distraction. You're no longer flattered by breadcrumbs because you've sat with yourself long enough to know what a full meal feels like. That's the kind of self-respect that doesn't have to be shouted. It's felt, it's seen. It radiates through your decisions, your time, your posture, the way you carry yourself when you walk into a room and know you're not there to prove anything. Because the standard is no longer about what someone else is willing to give. It's about what you've decided you will no longer live without. It's in the way you stop responding to low-effort behavior with over-effort. It's in the way you no longer feel guilty for saying no, for asking for clarity, or for needing real connection. You're not difficult, you've just raised the bar. And people who were only comfortable when the bar was low might start calling you intimidating, complicated, or hard to please. But that says more about their limitations than your worth. When you raise your standard, you automatically narrow the pool of who qualifies for access, and that's not you becoming cold. It's you becoming intentional. You start seeing time differently. You're no longer impressed by someone who can give you attention in short bursts, but disappears when things require depth. You're not entertained by cycles anymore. You're interested in peace. And peace doesn't come from temporary highs or emotional guessing games. It comes from knowing who you are and what you're building. So instead of trying to force your way into someone's life, you start asking a different question. Do they even deserve to be in yours? That question alone changes the dynamic. You're not chasing. You're observing. You're not proving. You're selecting. And that shift makes you more powerful than you realize. Because when you walk in your own lane, with your own pace, with your own purpose, people feel it. It's not arrogance, it's not ego. It's simply the quiet confidence of someone who's no longer waiting for permission to be taken seriously. You've stopped waiting for someone to choose you in order to feel chosen. You've made a decision to choose yourself. And from that place, you start attracting differently. You're no longer attracted to someone's potential. You're paying attention to their patterns. You're no longer drawn to chemistry without consistency. And you're no longer trying to make someone show up. You're watching if they do without prompting. Redefining the standard isn't about shutting people out. It's about protecting the life you've worked so hard to build. It's about curating your emotional environment. It's about not apologizing for needing what you need. And when someone comes into your life and can't meet you where you are, you no longer take it personally. You simply recognize they're not meant to stay. Because you're not molding yourself to be more palatable, more flexible, more convenient. You're showing up as you are and letting that be the filter. Either they rise to meet it or they fall away. Either way, your peace remains intact. Because the standard is no longer up for negotiation. It's become the baseline for who gets to be in your world. There's a kind of power that doesn't come from shouting, threatening, or pleading. It comes from certainty. Not the kind you fake when you're scared of losing someone, but the kind that grows when you finally understood who you are and what you bring to the table. Certainty is calm. It doesn't chase, it doesn't beg, it doesn't try to force someone to stay. It stands tall in the truth that you are already whole, already worthy, and already enough, regardless of who chooses to stay in your life. And when you start walking in that energy, everything about the way you show up changes. For a long time, you may have thought the breakthrough would come from a bold conversation, a grand ultimatum, or a dramatic exit. You imagined the moment when you'd finally say, "Enough is enough," and he'd realize what he was about to lose. But real power doesn't always look like a big scene. Most of the time, it's quiet. It happens when you decide, without needing to prove anything, that you are no longer going to tolerate the version of love that leaves you questioning your value. You stop looking for closure. You stop trying to convince. You stop writing long texts explaining your heart to someone who hasn't shown the capacity to hold it. Walking with certainty doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about yourself first. You're no longer operating from a place of fear. You're not afraid of being alone because alone no longer feels like punishment. It feels like peace. You're not afraid of what will happen if you let go because you trust that letting go of what isn't working creates space for what will. You're not clinging to someone's potential, hoping they'll change. You're assessing who they are right now and deciding if that matches where you're going. And if it doesn't, you're willing to walk away, not with resentment, but with resolve. You begin to understand that love isn't proven through pain. You don't need to suffer to earn someone's attention. You don't need to keep shrinking yourself to maintain harmony. You don't need to stay silent just to keep the peace. Certainty means you speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. It means you ask for what you need without apologizing. It means you stop making decisions from a place of needing to be chosen and start making decisions based on whether something aligns with your values, your worth, and your future. When you carry that kind of certainty, people respond differently. The ones who were used to you being overly available start to notice your absence. The ones who were used to you over-explaining your feelings start noticing the clarity in your silence. They feel the shift in you before you even say a word, because certainty doesn't need validation. It doesn't seek attention. It simply moves forward with or without a reaction. That shift can feel unfamiliar at first, especially if you've spent years tying your confidence to someone else's approval. You might find yourself tempted to go back to old habits, overthinking, second-guessing, reaching out just to feel something. But with time, that urge fades. Because you realize that every time you chose yourself, you felt stronger. Every time you didn't chase, you gained more peace. Every time you stopped trying to be understood by someone who wasn't listening, you got closer to hearing your own voice. This isn't about being cold or detached. It's about being grounded. Grounded in the understanding that real love won't require you to abandon yourself. It won't feel like a constant test. It won't leave you exhausted and confused. It will feel like safety, like respect, like being met at your level, not being pulled down to someone else's. And you don't get to that kind of love by staying in situations that constantly leave you feeling uncertain. So you start carrying yourself differently. You walk into rooms not wondering if you're enough, but knowing that anyone who doesn't see your worth is simply not your match. You stop over-functioning in relationships that underdeliver. You stop fantasizing about potential and start observing patterns. You stop holding on to what could be and start aligning yourself with what is. And from that place, you move forward. Not because you're trying to send a message, but because the message is already clear. You've outgrown the need to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself.